All right, today we are going to learn about lesson 3.2. You need to be on page 49 of your digits book, so go ahead and make sure you have that out and you are on this page. And we're going to go ahead and take a look at the launch together. You might be able to do this one on your own, but I think maybe us talking through it would be okay too. So our learning goal today is we're going to understand about perfect cube roots and the equation in the form x to the third equals p. And you'll notice that the only thing that's changed here is we were working on before perfect squared, and we're talking about square roots and equations in the form x squared equals p. So the only thing that's changed for today's lesson is instead of a 2, there's going to be a 3 there. And so you need to know the difference between those two. So in the launch it says, draw a line from each measurement to the figure it could represent. Explain how you know that you are correct. So the first one is saying, if this is a measurement, which one would this go with? Well, this is read 64 inches squared. And this squared actually comes from a square. And what this would mean is if I was going to find what the side length of the square is, which is what you did in lesson 3.1, it means those two are the same, and that would be x squared equals 64. And the way we talked about this in lesson 3.1 is you would square root both sides, and that would give you x equals 8. And normally we say x equals the positive and negative 8. Well, in this case, it only is positive 8 because you can't have a negative length of a side. And so that means this would be 8 inches, and that's why it's 64 inches squared. That's where the 2 is coming from, okay, because it's two-sided, and that's why we call it a square. So then we look at a cube, and it's saying it's 64 inches cubed, and we call this a cube, just like it has up here in the learning goal, a cube, because it actually comes from finding the volume of a cube, which means that for this equation, when I have x to the third equals p, that means I have something times something times something that is going to give me 64. So I would set up that equation, and I would say, okay, I would have x cubed equals 64. And so the way that I do that is I say, okay, what number times what number times what number is 64? And that, again, would be, you got to just try to say, you got to say, okay, would it be 2? So 2 times 2 times 2, does that work? 2 times 2 is 4, times that, so no, that doesn't work. So I say, okay, well, what else could I try? Could I try, say, 4? 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. So I say, okay, each side here is 4, because 4 times 4 times 4, 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. That's the difference between a cube root and a square root, and that's where these come from, this idea of a square and a cube. Okay, all right, so let's go ahead and look at our lesson today. And our focus question of the day is, how is solving an equation that includes cubes similar to solving an equation that includes squares? How is it different? Hopefully by me going over that launch, you see how they are similar and how they now are different. So that's kind of our big focus question for the day. All right, so first thing we're going to go to is your next page. At the top of that page, page 50, you should see that got it. And we're going to learn how to solve the cube root of negative 64. Okay, notice that these are also going to go in that top box, so make sure you leave yourself some space for these two. All right, so we're going to write this here, and I'm going to show you what the cube root looks like. Okay, cube root is going to look the same as a square root, except that we're going to put a baby 3 here. When you do a square root, it's understood that there's an imaginary 2 that sits there. You don't have to write it. But for any other root, which there are other roots, you do not have to put it there. So 3, anything else, you're going to put those numbers there. All right, so we are looking for what number times what number times what number is negative 64. Okay, because we have this negative. And before, we couldn't have a negative square root because I was only taking a number times itself. and there was no way that I could, if they're both negative, then that becomes positive 16. If they were both positive, it's positive 16. So this does not work. You can have a negative for a cube root because, like we just said, if I take negative 4 times negative 4 times negative 4, negative 4 times negative 4 is a positive 16, but then I take it to negative 4, and 16 times 4 is negative, whoops, got that wrong, is negative 64. So this is okay, and this is not going to have a positive and a negative answer. It's just going to have negative 4, because that is the only way that you can get negative 64. All right, forgot my little cube root there. All right, so let's go ahead and try another one of these before I set you loose on your own, because I'm not sure you probably get it at this point. So let's look at letter A. So go ahead and write this down. Notice I am still in part 1, got it, at the top box. I'm going to write this one down. All right, so to get rid of a cube root, or to get rid of something that's cubed, I'm going to use its cube root. So I'm going to take the cube root of that and the cube root of 8. All right, so you're trying to think what times what is 8. So 2 times 2 times 2. 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. And then you need to decide, is it positive or negative? Well, I want a positive 8 on the inside, so it's just going to be a positive 2. It does not get both answers. Okay? All right, I want you to pause the video right now, and I want you to go ahead and try this one and this one, and then I want you to stop and then check your work and make sure you're getting it right. So go ahead and pause now. All right, so you guys should be back at this point. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the cube root of both sides. So the cube root of x cubed is x. And we're looking for what number times what number times what number gets me a negative 27. So if I take 3 times 3 times 3, 3 times 3 is 9, times 3 is 27, and I need it to be negative 27, which means all these need to be negative, so it would be negative 3. Okay, next one, I'm going to take the square root, or cube root, sorry, and cube root. So x equals, and we should already know this one by now because we've done it 2 other times, and it's a positive 64, so it's going to be a positive 4. All right, so now if you got those 2 right, go ahead and see if you can figure out letter D, and see if you can figure out what the cube root is of 125. And go ahead and pause the video. All right, so you guys should be back. So we're going to say what times what is negative 125. So I have the cube root, and if I take 5 times 5 times 5, and I make them all negative, negative 5 times negative 5 is a positive 25, times negative 5, positive times a negative would give you negative 125. So x equals negative 5. All right, so let's look at the next thing we're going to talk about, and that is if you have a fraction. Now, we did this exact same thing with square roots. Now we're just doing it with cube roots. So the same rule applies, and this is the next, got it, this is at the bottom of that page. All right, so here, again, we're going to take the cube root, and if you guys remember, you take the cube root of both the top and the bottom, just like we did with square roots. So the cube root of this is y. If I take 1 times 1 times 1, 1 times 1 times 1 is still 1. So it's 1. And then I need to think what times what is 1,000. So 10 times 10 times 10 is 100, times another 10 gets me 1,000. So the cube root of 1,000 is 10, and this is positive, so my answer should be positive. Okay? All right, so looking at this one might be a struggle because you might not know what times what is 343. Make sure you're still in the same box, by the way, bottom box. Okay, so I'm going to take the cube root of this, the cube root of this, and the cube root of this. And I'm going to show you a little trick on your calculator. So if you don't have your calculator right now, you need to pause the video and you need to go get it. Okay? If you do have your calculator, then here's what we're going to do. here's what the screen will look like when I'm done so that you can go ahead and see. So notice I put a 3 out here. Notice that there is an x right here. So this 3 is actually going in for x to do the cube root. Okay, and then we're going to do the cube root of 125. So if I go ahead and do this one, I'm going to go ahead and put the cube. So I'm going to put in a 3 first, and then I'm going to do second, and then right here is the button I'm using. You can see it right above it. There's my cube root, and then 343. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And see, oh, there it goes. And there's 7, so it tells me that it's 7. So that means 7 times 7 times 7 is 343. So W equals 2 over 7, because 2 times 2 times 2 is 8 over 7. And that would be my answer. Okay? All right. If you need help with the calculator, just rewind and watch me do it again until you get it. All right. Moving on. All right, so now can we set up an equation? This is the first one. This is the part 3 at the top of page 51. Okay, it says a mailing carton in the shape of a cube. Okay, so that should tell me right there I've got a cube. Has a volume of 684 cubic inches. Okay, so I'm going to write volume equals 684. What is the length of one side of the carton to the nearest tenth of an inch? That's important that I'm reading that. Okay, that is no different than when we started today on our launch. Here's a cube. We knew the volume. We set up an equation. It's the exact same thing. So we're using this equation that was in our focus question to set this problem up. Okay, so here's the volume. So 684 equals x cubed. And now I'm going to take the cube root of both sides to figure out what each of those sides is. Okay, so again, I can go to my calculator because I might not know this one mentally. And again, I'm going to put in the 3 first for cube root. So I'm going to type in a 3. Then I'm going to hit the second button. So I'm going to hit second. And then I'm going to go to this button right here because that's where the x root is. And then now I'm going to plug in 684. Hit enter. And it told me to round to the nearest tenth. So to round to the nearest tenth, there's your tenth place. This number is the number I look at. That's a 1. 4 and below, you're going to let that go. So we're going to let it stay at 8. So to the nearest tenth, x is going to be 8.8. And then if it gave me units, which it did, so what that means is each of these sides is 8.8. And if I took 8.8 times 8.8 times another 8.8, I should be really close to, and see, I'm not super close because I rounded. And that goes back to the last chapter when we talked about rational and irrational numbers. Since this is an irrational number, it's an approximation. So when I round, you can see that I'm getting close, but I'm off because of the rounding. But that's okay, because that's still the right answer. All right? All right, I think with that, you guys can be done with your video lesson for 3.2.